Randolph Scott names the gay actors of old Hollywood who had to live in secret. Randolph Scott was born on January 23, 1898, in Orange County, Virginia, and raised in Charlotte and North Carolina, coming from a well-off Southern family. Scott attended Georgia Tech and later the University of North Carolina before serving in World War I. After his military service, he made his way to Hollywood, initially working behind the scenes before stepping into acting in the late 1920s. Though he began with minor roles, his rugged good looks, commanding presence, and gentlemanly charm quickly made him a leading man. He became especially beloved for his work in westerns, starring in over 60 films throughout his career, including classics like Ride the High Country, The Tall T, and 7 Men from Now. His characters were often quiet, principled men of action, mirroring his own private and dignified persona. Scott retired in 1962 at the height of his popularity, choosing a peaceful life away from the spotlight. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he left the screen with grace and financial independence. He passed away on March 2, 1987, at age 89, leaving behind a legacy of stoic masculinity and timeless Western heroism, the humble beginnings of Randolph Scott's film career. Randolph Scott's entry into the film industry was far from glamorous. After serving in World War I and studying at the University of North Carolina, he initially had no clear path into acting. However, a family connection with filmmaker Howard Hughes helped him gain access to the Hollywood studio system, starting out as an extra and bit part actor in the late 1920s. Scott paid his dues in silence, appearing in background roles while studying acting and refining his screen presence. His breakthrough came when he was cast in The Virginian, 1929, as a minor character. Though the role was small, it marked his transition from unknown to recognized talent. He began to earn more substantial parts, particularly in westerns and war films. By the early 1930s, he was already working with major studios like Paramount and RKO, sharing the screen with top stars. Scott's early career was shaped by patience, discipline, and an unshakable work ethic. He didn't rise to fame overnight, but his steady, determined climb proved that sometimes the strongest stars are those who take their time to shine. Randolph Scott, the quintessential cowboy of classic westerns. By the 1940s and 1950s, Randolph Scott had firmly established himself as the quintessential face of the American Western. While many actors took on cowboy roles from time to time, Scott lived and breathed the genre. Over the span of his career, he appeared in more than 60 Western films, far more than any of his contemporaries. With his tall, commanding presence, stoic demeanor, and calm, unwavering voice, he became the embodiment of the honorable gunslinger. Scott didn't need flashy theatrics or exaggerated bravado. Instead, he portrayed men who were firm yet fair, reserved yet courageous, and always guided by an unshakable moral compass. His characters were often the quiet force in chaotic landscapes, reliable, trustworthy, and grounded in a sense of justice. Scott's legacy was further solidified through his remarkable collaboration with director Bud Boetticher in the late 1950s. Together, they crafted a series of stripped-down, psychologically rich westerns that elevated the genre to new heights. Films like Ride Lonesome, The Tall T, and Comanche Station offered more than gunfights and horseback chases. They delved into the emotional complexity of frontier life. In these roles, Scott played characters who wrestled with redemption, isolation, and inner conflict. These films were lean and focused, often built around a single character's journey. And Scott's performances brought gravitas and subtlety to the screen. He wasn't just a man of action. He was a man with a past, with regrets, and with principles he refused to compromise. Unlike the more flamboyant, or morally ambiguous cowboys that emerged in later decades, such as Clint Eastwood's anti-heroes, Scott represented a more traditional vision of the Western hero. He was the last of a breed, strong, silent, dependable, and deeply principled. This unwavering image made him a cultural icon and a symbol of rugged American masculinity during the post-war era. Audiences trusted Scott. He didn't just play heroes, he was the hero, and his consistent portrayals made him a cornerstone of mid-century Hollywood. For fans of the Western, Randolph Scott wasn't just another actor. He was the soul of the genre. The Hidden Truth: 6 Closeted Hollywood Stars. Randolph Scott quietly. Though Randolph Scott became a household name for his stoic performances in Westerns and maintained a reputation as one of Hollywood's most private leading men, behind the scenes he carried a quiet awareness of a deeper, often painful reality shared by many of his peers. The public knew him as the rugged cowboy, the embodiment of traditional masculinity. But those close to Scott suggest that he lived a far more nuanced life, filled with empathy for others navigating the same unspoken terrain. For decades, whispers surrounded Scott's unusually close relationship with actor Cary Grant. The two shared a home for many years, and photos of their domestic life together were quietly circulated, but never publicly discussed. Scott himself never confirmed or denied these rumors. Yet, according to rare personal accounts and second-hand interviews with friends and insiders, he spoke with private understanding about the pressures faced by actors who had to hide their true selves in a rigid, heteronormative Hollywood system. Scott reportedly reflected, always in confidence, on the hidden struggles of 6 well-known actors whose sexual orientations were buried beneath public image and studio contracts. One was Rock Hudson, perhaps the most famous closeted actor of the era. Scott admired Hudson's poise and professionalism, understanding the weight he carried, performing for both the screen and society while living a life split in two. He also expressed sympathy for Montgomery Clift, a gifted yet tormented actor whose vulnerability on screen mirrored his inner anguish. Clift's battles with addiction and identity resonated with Scott, who recognized a kindred spirit in the man who quietly unraveled under public pressure. Then there was Tab Hunter, a golden boy heartthrob who carefully guarded his private relationships. Scott respected Hunter's ability to navigate fame while protecting the truth of who he was. Scott also spoke of Anthony Perkins, the psycho star whose career was overshadowed by persistent rumors and a complicated personal life. Perkins's internal struggle struck a chord with Scott, who believed discretion was not just a survival tactic, but a shared language among men like them. Ramon Navarro, a silent film legend, had once been socially acquainted with Scott. His tragic and violent death left a lasting impression, highlighting for Scott how brutal Hollywood could be to those who didn't conform. Perhaps most heartbreaking for Scott was the story of Sal Mineo, a talented young actor whose life was cut short before he could live freely. Scott reportedly felt a sense of protectiveness toward the younger generation, seeing in Mineo the same vulnerabilities he had witnessed for years: confusion, fear, and the looming threat of scandal. Throughout his life, Randolph Scott never gossiped, never exposed others, and never made himself the center of attention. But in his silence, he offered a quiet form of solidarity to those walking the same hidden path. He understood that beneath the glamour of Hollywood's golden age lay a world of unspoken truths, carried with strength and sorrow by the men who shaped it. The quiet influence of Rock Hudson on Randolph Scott. Though Randolph Scott belonged to an earlier, more conservative chapter of Hollywood history, his quiet admiration for Rock Hudson revealed a depth of compassion that few ever saw publicly. Scott, known for his stoic cowboy roles and private demeanor, never sought the limelight when it came to personal matters. Yet behind closed doors, he often expressed a deep respect for Hudson, not just as a fellow actor, but as a man who bore an unbearable burden with dignity. To those close to him, Scott often spoke about Hudson's kind of courage, not the loud, headline-making heroism, but the quiet kind that requires daily strength in the face of judgment, fear, and isolation. Rock Hudson, in Scott's eyes, was more than just a handsome leading man or a symbol of 1950s masculinity. He was someone navigating a painful reality, living a double life in an industry, an era, that offered little tolerance for those who didn't fit its narrow mold. Scott himself had long been discreet about his personal life. He lived in an age when the studios controlled every aspect of an actor's image, and rumors were quietly buried or avoided altogether. He understood the pressures Hudson faced, how charm, talent, and success could still be overshadowed by a secret too dangerous to reveal. The fact that Hudson endured all of this with poise only heightened Scott's admiration. What impressed Scott most was Hudson's emotional discipline. While others may have cracked under the weight of living two lives, one for the public and one in the shadows, Hudson carried himself with a calm, measured grace. He performed, smiled, and stood as a pillar of classic Hollywood glamour, all while concealing a part of himself that, if exposed, could have destroyed his career overnight. For Scott, that was a strength few could comprehend. The news of Rock Hudson's AIDS diagnosis in the 1980s struck a profound chord with Scott, though they were not known to be close friends. Scott understood what lay beneath the public headlines: years of silent suffering, the constant fear of exposure, and a deeply human yearning for acceptance. It wasn't just the illness that pained him. It was the tragedy of what Hudson had been forced to endure throughout his life. Randolph Scott never publicly addressed his reflections on Hudson, but those who knew him recall a tone of empathy and reverence in his private remarks. He didn't see Hudson as a tragic figure. He saw a man who stood tall despite the odds, who never let the harshness of the world rob him of his grace. In the end, Rock Hudson left behind more than a legacy of romantic films and screen presence. For Randolph Scott, and perhaps many others like him, Hudson represented the quiet heroism of authenticity in a time when silence was the only safe option. And in that silence, there was strength. The cause behind Randolph Scott's peaceful passing. Randolph Scott passed away on March 2, 1987, at the age of 89 in Beverly Hills, California. By the time of his death, Scott had long retired from the public eye, having stepped away from Hollywood in 1962 to live a life of quiet wealth, privacy, and personal contentment. The cause of his death was heart and lung failure, common complications associated with old age. Yet his passing, much like his life, was calm, dignified, and without spectacle. In his final years, Scott had been dealing with the natural effects of aging, including respiratory issues and reduced mobility. Friends and caretakers described him as mentally alert but physically frail. He preferred to stay at home, surrounded by familiar comforts and the quiet elegance that defined his later life. There were no tabloid scandals, no hospital drama, and no desperate attempts to cling to fame. Instead, Scott aged gracefully, accepting the decline of his body with the stoic courage that mirrored the roles he once portrayed. Those close to him noted that Scott never feared death. He saw it as a natural conclusion to a life well lived, a life of principle, discretion, and purpose. He had prepared for it in his own way, organizing his estate, leaving instructions for a modest burial, and requesting no public memorial. He didn't want tributes or headlines. As always, he preferred to let his work and his values speak for themselves. Randolph Scott's death marked the end of an era, but it was exactly the kind of ending he would have chosen: peaceful, private, and without fanfare. Just like the quiet cowboy who rode off into the sunset, he departed this world with dignity, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes through the hills of classic American cinema. Randolph Scott's legacy and final years. In his final decades, Randolph Scott lived far from the spotlight, but his influence on American cinema never truly faded. After retiring in 1962, Scott chose a life of privacy and financial independence in Beverly Hills, having invested wisely throughout his career. He had no need for public appearances or farewell tours. His legacy was already etched in film reels and the hearts of Western fans across generations, though he declined interviews and rarely stepped out for Hollywood events. Scott remained a revered figure in the industry. Directors, actors, and critics often pointed to him as the embodiment of the classic Western hero: calm, courageous, and morally unshakable. His work with director Bud Boetticher was especially praised for bringing psychological depth and quiet intensity to the genre. Films like The Tall T Ride Lonesome and Comanche Station are still studied today for their lean storytelling and complex characters, thanks in large part to Scott's controlled, dignified performances in his personal life. Scott lived simply. He spent time with his family, managed his estate, and enjoyed the serenity that came with a life lived on his own terms. His longtime friendship with Cary Grant, though never publicly labeled, remained one of the most discussed and speculated relationships in Hollywood history, another testament to Scott's deeply private nature. When Randolph Scott passed away in 1987 at the age of 89, he left behind more than just a body of work. He left behind a blueprint of a man who could be strong without shouting, elegant without vanity, and heroic without demanding praise. His legacy isn't loud. It lingers like the echo of hoofbeats on an empty trail. Life lessons from Randolph Scott: grace, discipline, and the strength of silence. The life of Randolph Scott is not only a chapter in Hollywood's golden age, it is a quiet masterclass in dignity, restraint, and staying true to oneself. While many of his peers sought the limelight until their last breath, Scott chose a different path. From his early days as a war veteran and a background actor to becoming one of the most iconic cowboys in film history, his journey offers enduring lessons for anyone navigating a world obsessed with fame, validation, and noise. First and foremost, Randolph Scott taught the value of discipline and self-respect. He didn't chase stardom through scandal or controversy. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. Scott rose through the ranks slowly but steadily, never compromising his principles or needing to reinvent himself to stay relevant. His consistent screen persona, strong, moral, silent, reflected a deep inner steadiness, something rare in an industry built on reinvention and image. Another powerful lesson from Scott's life is the virtue of privacy. In a town fueled by gossip and exposure, he was a man of few words, choosing instead to cultivate deep, lasting relationships and a quiet life away from the headlines. His long friendship and rumored romance with Cary Grant was never paraded in public. Instead, it was guarded with care and dignity, illustrating that love, whether romantic or platonic, can be powerful without being loud. Scott's life also reveals the importance of knowing when to walk away. At the height of his career, when he was still a box office draw, he retired. No dramatic decline, no scandalous end, just a graceful exit. In doing so, he preserved his image and his peace, showing that sometimes strength lies not in holding on, but in letting go with intention. Lastly, his story reminds us that heroism isn't always flashy. The quiet cowboy, the man who didn't raise his voice, who didn't chase applause, was just as strong, perhaps stronger, than those who demanded the spotlight. His films endure not just for their action, but for the moral clarity he brought to every role.